Prudence Thorne stood on a rough wagon box outside the church, her wrists trembling under a length of flour sack rope, while Pastor Abel Crow held up her work contract like it was a bill of sale. The whole town of Mercy Ridge stared at the servant girl with dust on her hem, a bruise of shame blooming across her face, and no one stepped forward when the pastor called her unfit for decent charity. Then a quiet cowboy in a black hat pushed through the crowd, his coat torn from trail work, his voice low enough to make the shouting stop. Simon Jarrett did not smile. He only looked at Prudence as if she were not ruined, not unwanted, not a thing to be purchased. Before we open the door to this dusty town, tell me your country in the comments. Subscribe if you love Western romances about public shame, unexpected rescue, and hearts that finally come home. The auction began beneath the church bell, though no prayer had opened it. Prudence Thorne could smell the pine boards of the wagon beneath her boots. She could smell horse sweat, dry dust, and the sour mash on the breath of men who had come more for spectacle than charity. Her wrists were not tied tight enough to hurt, but they were tied tight enough for everyone to see. That was the pastor's true purpose. Pastor Abel Crow stood beside her in his black coat, his silver watch chain bright against his vest. He was a tall, narrow man, with a voice that could fill a sanctuary and leave no room for mercy. This girl has been fed, sheltered, and instructed in the ways of honest labor, he called. And how does she repay Christian kindness? With disobedience, tears, and idle dreaming. A few women lowered their eyes. A few men laughed. Prudence stared past them all, at the road leading west, where the prairie shimmered under noon heat. She had walked that road once with hope in her chest, carrying a carpet bag and a letter that promised respectable work in a pastor's household. 6 months later, her bag was gone, her wages unpaid, and her name made dirty by the very man who had taken her in. Now, Pastor Crow continued, lifting the folded paper, her labor contract will be transferred to the highest bidder, for the good of the church debt and the good of her soul. The words struck harder than the rope. Transferred, sold. Prudence's throat closed. She had scrubbed his floors, cooked his meals, mended his shirts, nursed his wife through fever, and slept in a pantry that smelled of onions and lye. When his wife died, people whispered that Prudence had wanted the place of the dead woman. When Pastor Crow encouraged the whisper, the town believed it. She had no family in Mercy Ridge, no husband, no father to stand with a rifle and demand justice. Her mother was buried back in Missouri, beneath a crooked stone Prudence had never been able to afford replacing. Her father had disappeared before she could remember his face. $5, called Mr. Blevins, the storekeeper, from the front of the crowd. He was a round man with little pale eyes and hands always shiny from counting coins. Prudence had seen how he spoke to girls who owed him money. She felt the wagon boards tilt beneath her, though they had not moved. $5 for a strong pair of hands, Blevins said with a grin. She can sweep the store and sleep in the storeroom. I'll make sure she learns gratitude. A laugh rolled through the men. Pastor Crow nodded. $5 offered. Do I hear 7? Prudence forced herself to speak. Please? I never signed that paper. The crowd quieted just enough for her words to fall into dust. Pastor Crow turned, smiling softly for the town. Child, grief has made you confused. You put your mark here when I accepted you into service. I put no mark on anything. His smile did not change, but his hand closed hard around her arm. Do not shame yourself further. I have already been shamed enough, she whispered. The pastor's fingers tightened. Then a horse snorted at the back of the crowd. A man dismounted without hurry. Prudence noticed him because he did not push, did not call out, did not wear his goodness like Sunday clothes. He moved through the townspeople with quiet weight, and folks parted before they seemed to know they were doing it. He was tall, sun-browned, and broad through the shoulders, but there was a tiredness in him that made him look older than he likely was. A black hat shaded his eyes. One sleeve of his coat was patched at the elbow. He carried no rifle, only a coiled rope and a leather glove tucked into his belt. "Name your claim legal, Pastor," the man said. Pastor Crow looked down from the wagon, irritated. "Simon Jarrett, this is church business. Church business does not usually need rope." A murmur moved through the crowd. Prudence knew the name. Everyone did. Simon Jarrett owned the Cedar Bend place 3 miles north of town, a ranch with good water and bad memories. His wife had died 4 years earlier in childbirth, and a baby with her. Since then, he came to town only for supplies, church funerals, and a blacksmith. Folks called him quiet, the way they called a winter. Well, quiet, deep code, and not meant for company. Pastor Crow lifted the paper. "The girl owes service. Then show where the judge signed it. There is no need to involve the court in a matter of moral correction. There is when you are selling a woman." The word woman landed differently than girl. Prudence felt it like a hand at her back. Blevins snorted. "You bidding, Jarrett, or preaching?" Simon did not look at him. "I am asking whether this is an auction or a kidnapping." The crowd shifted again. Pastor Crow's face sharpened. "Careful. You have been lonely so long you might have forgotten how to speak among decent people." A few men chuckled, but not loudly. Simon stepped closer to the wagon. He looked up at Prudence, and for one breath, she expected pity. Pity would have undone her, but he only asked, "Did you sign that contract?" "No," she said, though her voice shook. "I never signed anything. He kept my wages. Then when I said I would leave, he said no decent house would take me." Simon's jaw tightened. "Do you want to go with Mr. Blevins?" The storekeeper's grin widened as if the answer were already owned. "No," Prudence said. "Do you want to stay with Pastor Crow?" She looked at the pastor. She remembered cold biscuits tossed on a plate, whispers through parlor doors, the pastor's hand on her shoulder when no one was looking, his wife's wedding ring disappearing the week after the burial, and his accusation that Prudence had stolen it. "No." Simon pulled a knife from his belt. The crowd gasped, but he only stepped up on the wagon wheel, took her bound wrists in his gloved hand, and cut the rope. Pastor Crow grabbed his arm. "You will answer for this." Simon looked down at the pastor's hand until the man removed it. "I expect so," Simon said. Prudence rubbed her wrists. Red lines circled them, thin as thread. For the first time since morning, she could breathe. Blevins spat into the dust. "You cut the rope, Jarrett. That make her yours." Simon's face went still. "No." The word was quiet, but it struck the crowd harder than a shout. He turned to Prudence. "You are not you are not his. If you need a ride to the sheriff, I will give it. If you need a place to stand while this gets sorted, I can offer that too. But I will not buy you." Prudence stared at him, confused by the shape of kindness without ownership. Pastor Crow lifted his voice. "This woman has no references, no proof, and no reputation. Take her into your house, Simon Jarrett, and you invite scandal." Simon looked at the church, then at the watching town, then back at Prudence. "Scandal has already been invited," he said. "I am only offering her a way off the wagon." He stepped down and held out his hand. Prudence did not take it at first. She had learned that every extended hand carried a price, but his remained steady, palm up, patient, not pulling, not claiming. Behind her, the pastor whispered, "You will regret this, Prudence Thorne." She believed him. She knew men like Pastor Crow did not lose quietly, but she also knew that if she stayed on that wagon, something inside her would die while her body kept working. So she placed her hand in Simon Jarrett's, and the town of Mercy Ridge watched a servant girl step down from an auction that should never have existed. Simon Jarrett's first act of help was not gentle enough to feel like rescue. He took Prudence to the sheriff's office, as he had promised, but Sheriff Nate Bell was out riding the South Road after cattle thieves. The deputy, a boy of 19 named Clem, looked terrified of the matter, and more terrified of Pastor Crow, who arrived 10 minutes later with Mr. Blevins and 2 church elders behind him. Prudence sat on a wooden bench near the door, her hands folded so tightly her fingers ached. Simon stood near the stove, hat in hand, saying little. The little office smelled of ink, tobacco, and wet wool, though the day was dry. Pastor Crow laid the paper on the desk. "Here's proof enough." Deputy Clem leaned over it. "Looks like a mark. It is not mine," Prudence said. "Can you prove that?" Blevins asked. Her face warmed. She could read a little, write less, and her name on paper had always looked like a child had dragged a twig through mud. That shame was another chain. Simon spoke. "Can he prove it is hers?" Pastor Crow smiled sadly. "Simon, grief has made you suspicious. No one here wished to harm the girl. We meant to place her under suitable supervision, by auction, by lawful transfer of obligation. Words do not wash dirt off a thing." The pastor's eyes flashed. Clem swallowed. "My be, we wait for Sheriff Bell. And where shall she sleep while we wait?" Blevins asked. "In your jail, or my be Jarrett's bed." The words cracked across the room. Prudence stood so fast the bench scraped. "I will sleep in the street before I give any of you that story." Simon's gaze moved to her, and she saw the hurt beneath his calm. Not hurt at her anger, my bay, but recognition of it. "My house has a spare room off the kitchen," he said. "The door has a latch from the inside. Mrs. Whitcomb can ride with us if she wishes, to see the arrangement is proper." Mrs. Whitcomb was the oldest widow in town, and the only woman present who had not looked away from Prudence. She stepped forward from the doorway, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "I will go," she said, "and I will tell any tongue in this town what I see with my own eyes." Pastor Crow's expression soured. "Martha, do not be foolish." "I have been foolish before," Mrs. Whitcomb said. "Usually while believing men who spoke too much about righteousness. That ended the meeting for the moment, but it did not end the trouble." Simon helped Prudence into his wagon without touching her more than necessary. He lifted Mrs. Whitcomb up after her, then climbed to the seat and took the reins. His team, 2 sorrel mares, leaned into the harness, and Mercy Ridge began slipping behind them. Church steeple, store porch, blacksmith smoke, faces turning like wind-bent grass. Prudence kept her eyes on her hands. She had expected rescue to feel like sunlight. Instead, it felt like being dragged into another unknown field after escaping a fire. She did not know Simon Jarrett. Quiet men could hide just as much cruelty as loud ones, sometimes more. After a mile, Mrs. Whitcomb spoke gently. "You hungry, child?" Prudence almost said no, because pride was the last good dress she owned. But her stomach cramped. She had eaten only coffee grounds and a heel of bread that morning before. Pastor Crow ordered her outside. "Yes, ma'am." Simon flicked the reins. "There is stew at the ranch. Bread too, unless Amos burned it." "Amos?" Prudence asked, before she could stop herself. "My hired hand. He is 60, lame in one knee, and convinced bread should be hard enough to build a chimney." Mrs. Whitcomb chuckled. Prudence did not. She wanted to, but laughter felt too dangerous. The Cedar Bend Ranch sat in a wide dip of land where cottonwoods grew along a creek. The house was plain but sturdy, with a deep porch, a stone chimney, and blue curtains faded almost gray. A barn leaned westward as if tired from years of wind. Chickens scratched near the steps. A black dog rose from the shade, wagged once, then studied Prudence with solemn eyes. "This is Abel," Simon said, then winced. The dog, named before the pastor came to town. Mrs. Whitcomb laughed outright this time. Prudence could not help it. A small breath escaped her, almost a laugh, and she hated how close it was to crying. Inside, the kitchen was warm and rough and alive, in a way Pastor Crow's house had never been. There were tin plates stacked by the basin, a flour sack folded on a chair, boots by the door, and a child's carved horse on the mantel. Prudence saw the toy before she meant to. Simon saw her seeing it. He crossed the room and took it down, placing it in a drawer with careful hands. "Old thing," he said. The lie sat between them. Mrs. Whitcomb looked at the floor. A gray-bearded man came in from the back room, carrying a loaf of bread that looked wounded. "Simon, I told you I had the bread handled," he said. Then he saw Prudence and Mrs. Whitcomb and went still. "Trouble, Simon said. "This is Miss Prudence Thorne. She will stay in the kitchen room until Sheriff Bell returns and the contract matter is heard. Mrs. Whitcomb is here to inspect our decency." Amos looked at Mrs. Whitcomb. "Find any, let me know. Been searching years." The old woman smiled. Prudence stood in the doorway, uncertain where to put herself. Servants entered kitchens to work, not to be welcome. She reached for the basin. "I can wash those dishes." Simon's voice stopped her. "You can eat first. I should earn." "No." The word came too hard. She flinched. Simon set his hat on the table and lowered his voice. "I am sorry. I meant, no one here will make you earn bread before you have swallowed any." Prudence looked at him, not sure what to do with an apology from a man who had not yet done much wrong. Amos cut the bread with difficulty. Mrs. Whitcomb ladled stew. Simon placed a bowl at the table and pulled out a chair, then seemed to realize even that might feel like command. He stepped back. Prudence sat because her knees were weak. The stew was plain beef and beans, but it tasted like rescue made edible. She ate slowly at first, then faster when her body betrayed her hunger. No one commented. That kindness almost broke her. After supper, Mrs. Whitcomb inspected the small room off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a rag rug, and a window facing the creek. The latch worked from the inside, just as Simon said. "It will do," the widow said. Prudence stood in the center of the room. "Thank you." Simon remained at the doorway, never crossing the threshold. "I ride early. Amos is here most days. You do not owe us work, but if keeping busy helps, speak to Amos. He will pretend he does not need help and then give you every chore he hates." Amos called from the kitchen. "I heard that." Simon almost smiled. Prudence touched the latch. "Why did you stop him?" The question had been pressing against her ribs since the wagon. Simon looked at the floorboards. Because nobody stopped a thing once when they should have. She waited, but he said no more. That night, after Mrs. Whitcomb left with promises to return in the morning, Prudence lay in the little bed with the latch set. Outside, wind moved through cottonwood leaves. The house creaked. Somewhere in the dark, Simon's boots crossed the porch, then stopped beneath her window. She held her breath. His voice came low, not meant to disturb. "You are safe tonight, Miss Thorne." Footsteps moved away. Prudence stared into the dark until tears slid into her hair. She did not believe she was safe. But for one night, no one opened the door. Morning at Cedar Bend began with a rooster, a barking dog, and Emma swearing at a coffee pot as if it had personally sinned. Prudence woke before sunrise, stiff with the habit of service. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then she saw the creek blue window, the rag rug, and the latch still set. No one had entered. No one had shouted. She dressed in the same brown calico she had worn the day before, washed her face, and stood in the kitchen listening. Amos was outside. Simon's deeper voice came from the bar. A cow lowed, a bucket clanged, and the world went on without asking permission from Mercy Ridge. On the table sat a folded cloth. Inside was a biscuit, 2 slices of bacon, and a note written in plain block letters. "Eat before work, if you choose work." There was no signature. Prudence sat with the food before her and cried, without sound for the second time in that house. She did choose work, not because Simon demanded it, but because her hands had no peace when empty. She swept the kitchen, mended a tear in Emma's coat, and found flour enough to make biscuits that rose, instead of surrendering. When Amos came in and saw them, he stared as if she had performed a church miracle. "Well," he said, "that is bread. A man does not need a hammer for. It is only biscuits. Miss Thorne, on this ranch, only biscuits might save us all." By noon, Prudence had discovered that Cedar Bend needed more than biscuits. The pantry shelves were confused. The garden fence sagged. The stove smoked when the wind turned north. And every curtain in the house had been washed so long ago that dust had become part of the fabric. She asked before touching anything. Each time, Amos waved her on. Simon, when he came in for water, looked startled by the changes and was startled by the smell of fresh bread. "You do not have to do all this," he said. "I know." He nodded slowly, accepting the difference. That became the first rule between them. He would not command, and she would not pretend helplessness. The sheriff returned 2 days later. He was a square-built man with honest eyes and a mustache too large for his face. He listened to Prudence in the Cedar Bend kitchen, while Mrs. Whitcomb sat beside her, like a small gray fortress. Simon leaned against the wall near the stove. Amos remained outside with a rifle, claiming he was cleaning it in the yard by coincidence. Sheriff Bell studied the paper Pastor Crow had presented. "This mark is a cross. I never mark with a cross," Prudence said quietly. "How do you mark?" She hesitated, cheeks hot. "With a P crooked sometimes. Can you show me?" Simon pushed paper and pencil toward her, without looking at what she wrote. That courtesy steadied her. She made her awkward P, then another. The sheriff compared them. "Not the same," he said. "Not proof by itself, but enough for questions. Did he withhold wages? Any record?" The pastor kept the accounts. "Of course he did," Mrs. Whitcomb muttered. The sheriff looked at Simon. "Crow has friends. So does she," Simon said. Prudence looked up at that. He did not look away. The sheriff promised a hearing the next Sunday after church, when the judge returned from circuit. Until then, Prudence remained at Cedar Bend, free to leave if she wished. But leaving required somewhere to go, and she had nowhere. Days gathered into a rhythm. She learned the ranch not as property, but as a wounded thing. The house had been kept alive, but barely. Simon had done what was necessary, and no more. In the parlor, a sheet covered a piano. In the bedroom at the back of the hall, the door stayed closed. In the kitchen drawer, the carved horse remained hidden. Prudence did not ask. Simon rode out before dawn and returned with dust on his shoulders. He fixed fences, checked cattle, hauled water, and spoke to his animals as if words were expensive and best spent on creatures who understood silence. At supper, he asked Prudence simple things. Too much pepper? No window latch still holding? I see, Mrs. Whitcomb coming tomorrow. She said she would bring thread. He never asked about Pastor Crow unless she brought him up. He never pressed for the story. He never stepped into the kitchen room. He knocked on open doors. Those small acts gathered like kindling. One afternoon, Prudence walked to the barn carrying mended gloves. She stopped outside when she heard Simon speaking. "No, Daniel," he said softly. "You would have laughed at me today." Prudence froze. Inside the barn, Simon stood near a stall, holding the carved horse from the mantel. Sunlight slipped through roof cracks and striped his face. He looked at the toy, the way a man looks at a grave he carries in his pocket. Prudence stepped back, but a board creaked. Simon turned. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to pry." He closed his hand around the horse. For a moment she expected anger. Instead, he looked only tired. "My son," he said. "Daniel, he lived 3 hours." The words were so bare that Prudence felt them enter her own chest. "And your wife, Clara, fever after the birth." The doctor was 2 days late because the bridge washed out. He looked toward the pasture. Town ladies came for a week after, brought pies, said God needed angels. Then they stopped coming. I was grateful when they did. Prudence took one step into the barn. People say foolish things when they cannot bear silence. They say cruel things too. His eyes returned to hers. "They are saying them about you now. I know. Blavin said today, you stole Mrs. Crow's ring. Pastor says he tried to keep it quiet out of mercy." Prudence's hands went cold. "I did not steal it. I know. You cannot know. I know the difference between a thief and a hungry woman who asks before using flour. A laugh broke from her, small and wounded. Then tears came too close and she turned away. Simon did not follow. He simply said, "Miss Thorne, what did happen?" She stood in the barn doorway with prairie wind pressing her skirt against her legs. "Mrs. Crow gave it to me the night before she died. She said to sell it if the pastor refused my wages. She said he had taken her mother's money and would take my labor next. I hid it because I was afraid. When he found it missing, he accused me before I could speak." "Where is it?" Prudence swallowed. "In the hem of my old shawl. Pastor Crow kept the shawl when he threw my things out." Simon's expression changed. Not loud, not dramatic, but something in him became iron. "We will get it back." "No," she said quickly. "He will twist it." Then we untwist it in daylight. The next Saturday, Simon drove Prudence and Mrs. Whitcomb into town. He did not hide her under a blanket. He did not make her enter by back alleys. He pulled the wagon to the store, helped Mrs. Whitcomb down, and then stood beside Prudence as she stepped onto the boardwalk. Every eye found her. Blevins leaned in his doorway. "Come to pay your debt, Miss Thorne." Prudence's knees trembled. Simon spoke before she could. "Came to buy coffee. Coffee is inside." "Then move." There was no threat in his voice, which somehow made it more threatening. Inside the store, whispers followed like flies. Prudence chose coffee, salt, and thread. At the counter, Blevins placed a licorice stick beside the parcel. "For the fallen lady," he said. "Sweeten her disposition." Simon reached for the licorice, broke it in half, and dropped it into the stove. "Charge me for it," he said. Prudence should have been embarrassed. Instead, she felt something warm and wild in her chest. Outside, a little girl stood near a hitching rail, crying over a torn doll. Prudence knelt and asked to see it. The child's mother hesitated, then allowed it. Prudence used her new thread to stitch the doll's arm back, while Simon loaded the wagon. "What is your name?" Prudence asked. "Lily." "Wow, Lily. She has been through a hard time, but she is not ruined." The child hugged the doll. "Thank you." Prudence felt Simon watching, but when she looked, he turned away. On the ride home, Mrs. Whitcomb smiled into her shawl. "What?" Prudence asked. "Nothing, child. Only that dignity has a sound." Today it sounded like licorice hitting a stove. For the first time in months, Prudence laughed without fear. The past returned on a Thursday, with a red horse and a man wearing city boots. Prudence saw him from the kitchen window while she was rolling dough. He rode beside Pastor Crow, his coat too fine for the trail, his smile too easy for the country. Her hands stopped moving. Simon was in the yard repairing a wagon tongue. Amos stood near the barn with a pitchfork. The black dog, Abel, growled low. Pastor Crow dismounted first. "Simon, I come with a peaceful offer." Simon did not rise from his crouch. Peace does not usually bring witnesses. The stranger swung down and dusted his sleeve. He had sandy hair, a narrow mustache, and the kind of handsome face that had learned to use itself as currency. "Name is Victor Lyle," he said. "I have come for Prudence Thorne." The bowl slipped in Prudence's hands. Flour spilled white across the table. Victor Lyle. She had known him in Missouri, though known was too generous a word. He had boarded at the house where her mother worked laundry. He had promised Prudence marriage when she was 17, and lonely enough to believe a man who praised her eyes. Then he borrowed her mother's savings for a business scheme, vanished, and left behind a letter saying Prudence had tempted him into debt. Her mother died, still ashamed of trusting him. Prudence had not spoken his name in years. Now he stood in Simon Jarrett's yard beside the pastor who had tried to sell her. She wiped her hands and stepped onto the porch. Victor smiled as if they were meeting after a pleasant misunderstanding. "There she is. Prudence, you have led folks on quite a chase. I did not know anyone was chasing me. Your reputation chased you plenty." Simon finally stood. "Careful." Victor glanced at him, amused. "I do not mean offense. I am here to make matters right." Pastor Crow wrote me concerning her fallen circumstances. I am willing to marry her and remove the stain. The yard went so quiet, Prudence heard the creak. Pastor Crow folded his hands. Mr. Lyle has shown Christian generosity. He knew Miss Thorne before her troubles. If she accepts, the town will forgive much. Prudence's mouth went dry. Forgive what you invented. Crow's eyes narrowed. Do not refuse your last chance at respectability. Victor stepped closer to the porch. Come now, Prue. You always were dramatic. I can give you a name, a home. You do not want to remain here as a burden to a widower who pities you. Simon's face closed at the word widower. Prudence saw it. She saw how the old wound opened without blood. You took my mother's savings, she said. Victor sighed. A business loss. You let her die believing I had helped you steal it. I was young. ISO was I. Pastor Crow lifted his chin. Old accusations do not change present need. You have no standing here, Prudence. You live under Simon Jarrett's roof, without kin. Mercy Rich is not Bly. No, Simon said. Just willing to look where you point. Crow turned on him. And what of your motives? You keep a woman in your house and speak of righteousness? Your wife has barely been cold in the ground 4 years. That struck. Simon flinched before he could hide it. Prudence stepped off the porch, anger burning away fear. Do not speak of his wife. Pastor Crow smiled. You defend him like a wife already. Her face flushed. Victor moved fast, seizing the moment. He took her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to remind her of rope. Let us speak privately. Simon's hand closed around Victor's forearm. Let go, Simon said. Victor laughed. You want to fight for her? No, I want you to hear her. Prudence pulled her wrist free. I will not marry you. Victor's smile thinned. You should consider carefully. I have letters. Old ones. Yours to me. Her stomach dropped. At 17, she had written foolish letters full of longing, trusting him with thoughts she had never spoken aloud. He had kept them. I can read them in town, Victor said softly. People will enjoy them. They will know what sort of woman you were before Pastor Crow ever met you. Prudence felt the yard tilt as it had on the wagon box. Simon stepped between them. Leave. Pastor Crow raised a hand. This is not over. The hearing is Sunday. Mr. Lyle will testify to her character. My character, Prudence said. He ruined my mother. Victor tipped his hat. Strong claims need proof, Prue. Do you have any? She did not. After they rode away, the ranch felt colder, though the sun was high. Prudence went to the barn because she could not breathe in the kitchen. She stood in an empty stall, arms wrapped around herself. Shame was strange. It did not care whether the accusation was true. It only cared who heard it. Simon came to the doorway, but did not enter. I am sorry. For what? For not stopping him sooner. You stopped enough. No, his voice was rougher than she had heard it. I stood there, while Crow used Clara against me. I still let dead things make me slow. Prudence turned. Loving someone who died is not weakness. It is when you use grief as a lock gate. She looked at him carefully. Is that what you have done? He leaned against the doorframe. After Clara died, I blamed the town for speaking wrong, the doctor for coming late, God for taking too much. But mostly I blamed myself. I had insisted we stay at Cedar. Been through storm season. She wanted to be closer to town before the birth. I said the creek would hold. Prudence's heart softened, and it did not. The bridge washed out. I carried her in my arms halfway before the fever took her mind. She kept asking me to save the baby. I could not save either. His voice broke on the last word, barely. Prudence crossed the barn slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. Simon Jarrett. If guilt could bring people back, graveyards would be empty. He closed his eyes. She did not touch him, though part of her wanted to. He had given her the mercy of not reaching too soon. She gave it back. I am afraid, she said. His eyes opened. Of Sunday, of Victor, of those letters, of the pastor standing in God's house and making me small. You are not small. You are not small. I feel small. Then stand beside me until you remember your size. The words moved through her like prayer. That evening, Mrs. Whitcomb came with news. Pastor Crow had announced that the hearing would take place in the church after service, before the judge and the congregation. He claimed it was necessary for moral clarity. Blevins had been telling customers that Prudence had bewitched Simon, and Victor Lyle had taken a room above the store. Amos spat tobacco into the yard. We ought to take a rope to all three. No, Simon said. They want ugliness. We will bring truth. Mrs. Whitcomb placed a bundle on the table. Then you might need this. Inside was Prudence's old shawl. She stared at it. How? I visited Pastor Crow's wash shed, the widow said. And before anyone judges me, remember I am old, quick with a hatpin, and tired of wicked men owning cubars. Prudence seized the shawl. Her hands shook as she found the hem and tore open the secret seam. Mrs. Crow's ring fell into her palm. Gold, plain, warm from the cloth. Alongside it was something she had forgotten. A tiny folded paper Mrs. Crow had pressed into her hand while fever burned her cheeks. Prudence opened it. In a weak slanting hand it read, Prudence is owed $12 and kindness. Abel knows. He has not been kind. The room blurred. Simon bowed his head. Mrs. Whitcomb whispered, There is your proof, child. But proof did not stop danger. It only called danger into the light. Outside, the church bell rang for evening prayer, and the sound crossed the prairie like a warning. On Sunday morning, Mercy Ridge filled the church before the first hymn. Men stood along the back wall. Women crowded the pews with fans in hand. Children were hushed and then hushed again. Even the blacksmith came washed and stiff in his collar. The hearing had become more than a question of a servant girl's contract. It had become a show, and the town had dressed for it. Prudence sat beside Mrs. Whitcomb 3 rows from the front. Simon sat on her other side, not touching her, not leaning close, simply present. Amos stood in the back with his hat crushed in both hands, glaring at anyone who turned around. Pastor Crow preached first. That was his power. He wrapped accusation in scripture and called it concern. He spoke of fallen women, of rebellion, of wolves dressed as lambs. He never said Prudence's name during the sermon, but every eye found her anyway. Her hands trembled in her lap. Simon saw. He placed his open hand on the pew between them, palm up, not touching. A choice. Prudence looked at it for half the sermon. Then, while Pastor Crow thundered about obedience, she placed her fingertips in Simon's palm. His hand closed gently around hers. It was not a confession, not yet. It was steadiness shared in public. After the final hymn, Judge Harlan Pike took a chair near the pulpit. He was a heavy man with silver brows and a voice worn by tobacco and weather. We will hear the matter of Prudence Thorne. Alleged contract service, alleged theft, an alleged moral complaint. Alleged everything, Amos muttered from the back. Judge Pike looked over his spectacles. Who said that? No one answered. Pastor Crow stood first. He presented the contract. He described Prudence as unstable after Mrs. Crow's death, ungrateful for shelter, and caught with missing property. He said the auction had been a charitable correction, misunderstood by those with worldly minds. Then Mr. Blevins testified that Prudence had accepted credit at his store, under false pretenses. I never accepted credit, Prudence said. Blevins smiled. You ate peppermint from my counter. You gave one to Mrs. Crow for me when I was 12 days sick from washing your fever linens. The church murmured. Blevins reddened. That is not the matter. Then Victor Lyle stood. Prudence's grip tightened around Simon's hand. Victor smiled at the judge, at the congregation, at Prudence. I knew Miss Thorne in Missouri. She was emotional, prone to romantic ideas, and careless with propriety. I tried to guide her once, but she formed attachments beyond reason. He pulled letters from his coat. These are private letters proving the nature of her heart. The church leaned forward as one body. Prudence felt 16 again, foolish, motherless before her mother had even died, hungry to be loved and punished forever for believing love could come in a fine coat. Victor unfolded the first letter. Simon stood. Judge Pike frowned. Mr. Jarrett, those letters were written by a young woman to a man who used her trust. Reading them proves nothing except his character. Victor laughed, afraid of what they say. Simon's voice remained level. No, I'm afraid this town has mistaken shame for entertainment. Pastor Crow rose. Sit down, Simon. Your attachment is obvious. Yes, Simon said. The word rang through the church. Prudence looked up sharply. Simon turned toward the congregation. His face was pale, but his voice did not shake. My attachment is obvious. I am attached to truth. I am attached to the belief that no woman should stand in a church and have her private grief sold for laughter. I am attached to the fact that Prudence Thorne was placed on a wagon with rope around her wrists, while men bid her labor. If that does not shame this town, then her old letters are not the wickedest thing in this room. Silence fell. Prudence felt tears burn, but she did not lower her head. Victor's jaw tightened. Fine speech. But will you marry her then? Or only keep her under your roof and polish your loneliness with her gratitude? The cruelty of it struck its mark. Simon looked at Prudence. There it was, the public choice, the kind that could become another chain if made wrongly. He could say yes and make her a shield for his honor. He could say no and leave her exposed. The whole town waited to see which wound would open. Simon removed his hat. I will not answer for her life, he said. Prudence Thorne does not need me to make her decent. She already is. If one day she chooses me, I will count myself blessed. If she never does, I will still stand here today and say what I saw. She was wronged. The church held its breath. Prudence's tears slipped free then, not from shame, but from the terrible relief of being defended without being claimed. Judge Pike cleared his throat. Miss Thorne, do you have testimony? She stood. Her knees trembled, but Simon's hand remained steady until she let go. She walked to the front with Mrs. Crow's ring and note folded in a handkerchief. My name is Prudence Thorne, she said, and her voice sounded small at first. She took a breath. I came to Mercy Ridge for work. Mrs. Crow was kind to me. Pastor Crow was not. He kept my wages, and when his wife died, she gave me this ring to sell if I needed what I was owed. Pastor Crow stepped forward. That is a lie. Prudence held up the note. Judge Pike took it. His brows lowered as he read. Prudence is owed $12 and kindness. Abel knows. He has not been kind. The church shifted. Pastor Crow's face drained and flushed. My wife was fevered. She did not know what she wrote. Mrs. Whitcomb stood. She knew enough to hide the truth where your hand could not reach it. Prudence faced the congregation. I hid the ring because I was afraid. That was my mistake. But I did not steal it. I did not sign that contract. I did not ask Mr. Jarrett to rescue me so I could trap him. He gave me a room with a latch. He gave me work only when I asked for it. He gave me the dignity many of you forgot I had. Heads bowed. Not all, but enough. Then the church doors opened. A young woman entered carrying a boy on her hip. Her bonnet was dusty, her face thin with travel. Judge Pike, she called. I was told Victor Lyle would be here. Victor turned white. The woman walked down the aisle. I am Annabelle from St. Joseph. This man promised marriage, took my brother's money, and left me with his son. The boy stared at Victor with the same sandy hair, the same narrow chin. The same narrow chin. Mercy Ridge erupted in whispers. Victor moved toward the side door. Amos stepped in front of it, going somewhere. Judge Pike banged his cane. Order, but truth, once loosed, did not return quietly. Annabelle produced her own letters. Victor's hand, Victor's promises, Victor's debts. Sheriff Bell, who had arrived at the back during testimony, took Victor by the arm before he could run. Blevins backed toward the door next, but Mrs. Whitcomb pointed at him. And that one tried to bid on a woman like she was a mule. The judge's gaze hardened. I heard. Pastor Crow stood alone near the pulpit. His black coat suddenly only cloth. His silver chain only metal. Judge Pike declared the contract void, the mark false, the auction unlawful, and Prudence free of debt. He ordered Pastor Crow to pay her owed wages from church funds he had misused, and to surrender the pulpit pending a church council. The congregation stared at the pastor who had taught them shame and called it holiness. Prudence should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt tired enough to fall. Outside, under the hard white sun, townspeople gathered in uneasy clusters. Some would apologize later. Some would pretend they had never believed the worst. Some would resent her for making them see themselves. Blevins tried to slip past with his head down. Lily, the little girl whose doll Prudence had mended, stood on the boardwalk and said loudly, "Mama, that is the man who wanted to buy Miss Thorne." Her mother pulled her close, but she did not correct her. Simon walked beside Prudence to the wagon. At the step, she stopped. "You said if one day I choose you." He looked at her carefully. "I did? You did not say it to force me." "No. What if I am too broken for choosing?" "Then I will wait until you know broken things can still choose." She looked at his weathered face, his tired eyes, the grief he carried, without asking her to heal it. She thought of the room with a latch, the biscuits left before work, the hand open on the pew. "I choose to ride home," she said softly. "With you." His eyes warmed, but he did not smile too much. He understood the size of that choice. "Then home we go," he said. Home did not become easy all at once. That was the truth Prudence learned in the weeks after the hearing. Mercy Ridge changed, but slowly. Pastor Crow left town before the church council could finish with him, taking one trunk and none of his dignity. Victor Lyle was held for fraud until men from Missouri came to claim him for older debts. Mr. Blevins kept his store, but women watched him differently, and men who owed him money began asking for written accounts. Prudence received $12 in wages and an apology from 2 elders who could not meet her eyes. She accepted the money. The apology she only nodded at, because forgiveness was not a performance to make guilty people comfortable. Some Sundays, people spoke kindly. Other days, whispers still followed her. A lie did not die just because truth shot it through the heart. It staggered on in corners, fed by those who preferred the old story. But Cedar Bend grew warmer. Prudence planted marigolds near the porch because Mrs. Crow had loved them. She washed the curtains, aired the parlor, and one afternoon asked Simon if the piano should remain covered forever. He stood in the doorway a long while. Clara played. "I know. I have not heard it since. I can dust it without playing." He nodded. She uncovered it gently. Dust rose in a silver cloud. The piano was out of tune, but beautiful beneath neglect. On its top sat a framed photograph of Clara Jarrett, round-faced and smiling, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. Prudence looked at it without jealousy. The dead were not rivals. They were rooms in the heart already furnished. "She was lovely," she said. Simon's voice came quietly. "She was kind. I wish I had known her." He looked at Prudence then, really looked, and something eased in his face. "She would have liked you." That evening, he took the carved horse from the drawer and placed it back on the mantel. No speech, no grand announcement, just a little wooden horse, standing in lamplight where grief had once hidden it. Amos pretended not to cry and failed. Annabelle and her small son, Thomas, stayed in Mercy Ridge for a time, while the court settled matters with Victor. She had no money and no wish to return east in shame. Prudence invited her to Cedar Bend for supper. Simon agreed before she finished asking. Thomas was 3, bright-eyed and solemn. He followed Abel the dog everywhere and called Simon Mr. Quiet. The first time he climbed into Simon's lap, with a biscuit in his fist. Simon went still as stone. Prudence watched from the stove, her heart aching. "Want half?" Thomas asked, offering the biscuit. Simon looked down at the child. Slowly, carefully, as if handling a newborn colt, he accepted the broken piece. "Thank you." Thomas nodded. "You sad?" The room froze. Simon swallowed. "Sometimes my mom is sad, too." "Biscuits help." Amos turned away toward the window, shoulders shaking suspiciously. From then on, Thomas came often. Anna helped Prudence sew. Mrs. Whitcomb brought gossip and called it intelligence. Sheriff Bus stopped by for coffee more than law required. The kitchen filled with voices, and Cedar Bend, which had been only surviving, began living again. As winter approached, Simon built a new shelf in the pantry and fixed the roof over Prudence's room. He did not ask her to stay. That was the one hurt she could not name. Every board he hammered sounded like care, but every unasked question sounded like fear. One cold evening, church bells carried across the prairie for a wedding in town. Prudence stood on the porch in a wool shawl, listening. Simon came out beside her. "Cole, yes, you should go in." "I will." Neither moved. The sunset burned low over the pasture, turning grass copper and the creek dark blue. Horses stood in the distance, their breath white. Prudence said, "Do you ever think about leaving Mercy Ridge?" "No, even after what they said of you. They were not all wrong. I was hiding." She looked at him. A hidden man still stopped an auction. A frightened woman still stood in church and told the truth. I was terrified. I know. The wind moved between them. Simon took off his hat, turning it in his hands. For once, he seemed less like a quiet cowboy and more like a man standing at the edge of a river he did not know how to cross. "Prudence," he said, then stopped. Her heart beat hard. "I have been careful," he continued. "Maybe too careful. I did not want my kindness to feel like a debt. I did not want my grief to become your work, and I did not want to speak before you had a place in this world that did not depend on me." She held the shawl tighter. "You have that now," he said. "Your wages, your name cleared, friends who would stand in daylight for you. If you choose to leave, I will hitch the wagon myself and take you anywhere the road allows." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled a little. "That is a poor proposal." His face changed. "I have not made it yet." "Then you had better improve." For the first time since she had known him, Simon Jarrett laughed. Not much, but enough to startle a horse near the fence. He stepped closer, leaving space between them still. "Prudence Thorne, I love you. Not because you needed saving. Not because you made this house warm. Not because loneliness made me reach for the nearest hand. I love you because you tell the truth, even when your voice shakes, because you give dignity to dolls and widowers and women who arrive with nothing, because you stayed kind without staying silent. I would be honored if you became my wife. But if your answer is no, you will still have my respect, my friendship, and a place at this table as long as you need it." Prudence cried then, openly. No one had ever offered love without a trapdoor beneath it. She stepped close and placed her hand against his chest, over the heart that had buried too much and still kept beating. "My answer is yes," she whispered, "but not because I have nowhere else to go." His eyes shone. "I know," he said. She smiled through tears. "And I want marigolds at the wedding." "Then we will have marigolds. And Mrs. Whitcomb must stand with me. She will command the whole church if asked, and Amos must not bake the bread." From inside the house, Amos shouted, "I heard that." They laughed together on the porch while the first stars came out. The wedding took place in spring, when the prairie turned green and the creek ran bright with snowmelt from distant hills. The church had a new pastor by then, a humble man named Reverend Silas Boone, who preached mercy as if he had met it personally. He stood beneath the same bell that had once watched Prudence shamed on a wagon box. This time there was no rope, no bidding, no cruel laughter. There were marigolds in jars along the aisle. Mrs. Whitcomb stood beside Prudence, proud as a queen. Annabelle held Thomas in the front pew, and the boy waved until Simon nearly lost his solemn face. Amos wore a suit that had last seen daylight before the war and wept into a handkerchief he claimed was for dust. Sheriff Bell stood near the door, not because trouble was expected, but because he said every good ending deserved a guard. Some townspeople apologized before the ceremony. Mrs. Haskins, who had once crossed the street to avoid Prudence, took her hands and said, "I should have spoken." Prudence looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said gently. "You should have." Mrs. Haskins cried. Prudence squeezed her hands. "Speak next time." That was the forgiveness she could give, not pretending the wound had not happened, but asking the healed place to protect someone else. When she walked down the aisle, Simon watched her as he had watched her step from the wagon, not as a prize, not as a rescued thing, but as a woman choosing where to place her feet. Reverend Boone asked who gave her away. Mrs. Whitcomb lifted her chin. "No one gives Prudence Thorne away. We stand with her while she gives herself." A murmur moved through the church, then a soft amen. Simon's hand trembled when he took Prudence's. She felt it and loved him more for trembling. Their vows were plain. He promised honor, shelter, truth, and partnership. She promised kindness, courage, loyalty, and laughter when the bread came out wrong. The church smiled at that, and Amos made a wounded sound from the pew. When Simon kissed her, it was gentle and brief, but it held the whole road between the auction wagon and that altar. Afterward, Cedar Bend filled with food, fiddles, and lantern light. Children ran through the yard. Thomas fell asleep against Abel the dog. Annabelle danced once with Sheriff Bell and blushed so fiercely that Mrs. Whitcomb began planning a future with her eyes. The piano, tuned at last, stood uncovered in the parlor. Prudence played a simple hymn, while Simon stood nearby with Clara's photograph on the mantel and Daniel's carved horse below it. Nothing had been erased. That was what made the piece real. Late that night, when guests had gone and the lanterns burned low, Prudence stepped onto the porch in her wedding dress. Simon followed with 2 cups of coffee. The same road to Mercy Ridge lay silver under the moon. The same town sat beyond the dark. The same church bell hung in its tower. But Prudence was not the same woman who had stood bound before it. Simon handed her a cup. "Tired, Mrs. Jarrett." She looked at him over the rim. "Very, Mr. Jarrett. Happy." She considered the question, because happiness had once seemed too fragile to name. "Yes," she said, "but more than happy. Free." He nodded, understanding the difference. She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Not to claim, to shelter, to belong and be belonged to. Across the yard, the marigolds glowed in the moonlight like small brave fires. The prairie wind moved soft through the cottonwoods. Somewhere far off, a train whistle cried, carrying other lonely souls toward other dusty towns, other hard choices, other chances to be seen. Prudence closed her eyes and listened. Once, a pastor had tried to sell her beneath a church bell. Once, a quiet cowboy had stopped the auction. But the truest rescue had taken longer. It had come in a room with a latch, a hand left open on a pew, bread offered before work, truth spoken in public, grief uncovered without shame, and love patient enough to wait until it could be chosen freely. At Cedar Bend, the kitchen stayed warm. The door stayed open to those who needed mercy. The carved horse remained on the mantel. The piano did not gather dust again, and every spring marigolds bloomed beside the porch, bright as sunrise, stubborn as hope, reminding all who passed that a woman's worth was never decided by the voices that tried to sell her, but by the God who made her, the courage that kept her standing, and the love that finally gave her a home.